and welcome to our webinar. It's lovely to see you all here today. I'm Lucy. I'm the COO here at Stripe, and I look after all of our customer and marketing operations. Just while we're waiting for everyone to get in and join us, it would be great if you could say hi in the webinar chat box. Just introduce yourself, your role, what you're trying to get out of today. And if you have any questions at all, please make sure you pop them into the Q&A box as well. That gives everyone the opportunity to upvote them, and it'll make sure that we can prioritize the questions that everyone wants to hear from towards the end. We do have some time at the end of this webinar to go through any questions. So please make sure you'll get them in early, and we will make sure we get them all answered. One thing I will say as well is that we really encourage you all to share what you've learned after the webinar. So we would love to hear about the tips and tricks that you've picked up and found really valuable from today. So please do share them. If you are sharing them on social media, I would love to see them. So make sure you tag me or tag Stripe, and we'll really love reading those this afternoon. And one final point is I will just say that we want this talk to be really interactive. So once everyone's done the introductions, we will be asking you just to pop some answers into the comment box. Nothing too difficult, don't worry. But just to keep your brains ticking over today. Hi, Michelle, and hi, Josephine. It's so lovely to have you here today. Please make sure you're popping any questions. It doesn't need to be necessarily related to the specific topic of the webinar today. If you have anything related to pulse surveys that you want us to answer and talk about, feel free to pop that in the Q&A box too. So let's get started. So just having a think about maybe the last 10 customer surveys that you've been asked to complete. And that might be from your bank, your telephone providers. How many have you actually completed and submitted? And please just pop your answers in the chat box now. So answering truthfully, how many of those customer surveys that you've been asked to answer recently do you think you've actually completed? I know for me, it's maybe about 10%. Hi Joe, lovely to have you. Josephine saying 1 out of 10. Corey, depends if there is an incentive. That's very, very true. And it seems to me that everyone is yes, definitely on the lower end. Yeah, Michelle also right that if they are going on a bit, then we have to give up and drop out. And again, I guess that's kind of jumped ahead. Why don't we answer those customer surveys? So, Corey, you've mentioned there about the incentive. Perhaps that would help. Michelle, you've mentioned about being a bit long. We're having some great contributions here. But yeah, other reasons might be that maybe the questions are phrased a bit awkwardly, or the questions themselves are a bit long. And like a lot of us have mentioned already, we don't just quite see what's in it for us. So there's a lot of different reasons when we're looking at ourselves and how we approach surveys as to why we might not engage with them. But we know as HR folk that we need to gather employee feedback. And it's something that's really important to us, and it's something that really helps us achieve our objectives in our work. But many of us are making probably the same mistake as banks. I'm sure some of you have maybe had a little laugh to yourselves this morning when you've just said that answer to me, and you've realized that maybe on reflection you are doing some of these things. We can, as businesses, make employee surveys sometimes quite dull, quite time consuming, and we also can fail to prove the benefits to our workforce as well. So as a result of all of that, sometimes completing surveys becomes an inconvenient task for employees, as well as it does for us when we're being asked to answer those customer surveys. And there are two issues that this really creates for us. One, employees are going to rush through those surveys. I think someone mentioned doing that in the Q&A box there. They might skip questions. They might answer in a way that doesn't actually reflect their true feelings. They're just putting 1 or 10 out of 10 for everything. And that's going to give you inaccurate data, and you're going to be building your strategy or building your action plan with that data. Longer term, these mistakes also contribute towards our response rate too. So employees will become less and less likely to participate over time, which ultimately means that you're getting less and less data, and that data is less reflective of your group that you're working with. So you can avoid this with a few kind of best practice tips and tricks. And today we're going to be covering off the 8 mistakes. I actually got quite excited when I was writing this presentation. So it's actually 9, you're getting 1 for luck. So we're covering 8 mistakes that you might be making that are impacting your employee surveys. We're going to cover off those mistakes, and we're also going to go through the tips and tricks to help you avoid them, plus the 1 for luck. So mistake 1, we'll get right into it. Not having a clear goal for your employee survey. When scientists conduct research, they always start with a hypothesis. They have maybe speculated about something, an issue may be at hand, and then they'll use that research to confirm or deny their assumption. Surveying your employees without a clear goal in mind is kind of like running a really expensive research project without actually understanding what you're researching. It's just not something that would happen in the scientific world. And anytime you gather employee feedback through surveys, you need to have an understanding of the goal of the survey. And that really does underpin everything within your strategy. So some reasons or goals for surveying employees might be understanding the cause of HR issues, so such as high employee turnover, absenteeism, maybe reviewing your employee experience, that might be onboarding, training, development, understanding employee happiness, researching employee sentiment about part of their workday, maybe workload, compensation, management, etc., or gaining knowledge to help you build a new policy. That might be new benefits, a work from home policy, maternity leave, etc. But a clear goal is important because, one, it helps you build your survey and decide on the best questions to include. You don't need to ask questions about pay and reward if you want to understand how employees feel about your learning and development program. So, where we're saying, oh, those surveys are too long, a clear goal really helps you avoid that. And it also gives employees a clear incentive to answer that survey. When employees understand why you're surveying them and what changes they'll see if they participate, they're always going to be more likely to complete the survey. So how do we avoid this mistake? 1, never create a survey without asking yourself why. How can you use the data to improve the work lives of your employees? And one thing I will add on this, and we do get into kind of survey cadence later on, but it is okay sometimes to not run a survey, even if you had one planned, if you don't have that why. Okay, because when we're thinking about those overall objectives of response rates and gathering data that really supports our action planning, it's really important that we keep those in mind when running those surveys. Make sure that that why is evident in your survey communications, okay? So the name of the survey that you're running, the communications themselves, making sure that managers are really aware of the why as well. Just make sure it's front and center of everything you do. And make sure the name of the survey itself is really, really specific. So it might not be an external name to your employees themselves. It might just be an internal name that you're using within the team or the couple of folk that are working on that survey. But keeping it specific, make sure that you're keeping that why front of mind and you're working forwards towards that. So, instead of employee engagement survey, you're saying employee survey on learning and development. And that just makes sure that you're really keeping that why in the forefront. So mistake number 2, not having a goal that is tied to employee engagement itself. It can be really easy to send out surveys without making it clear to employees how it's tied to a larger objective. So it's one thing having a goal, but how does it really align to what we're trying to achieve for employees and their engagement? Launching surveys in this vacuum and focusing on the task in hand without making it clear how it ties to employees and their needs will mean that employees view their survey as just another admin task for their to-do list, and it will ultimately result in a low response rate. So we need to make sure we're aware of everything around us. So why is having that aligned goal so important? Employees will understand how their feedback contributes to change, and that ultimately will prompt them to participate. Without a goal aligned to employee engagement at your organization, you also risk gathering feedback for a topic area that you might actually not be able to affect change on. So again, just making sure that your surveys are very achievable and they support your employees. You also want to make sure that your survey remains aligned to your own employees' needs. So employee engagement is a really, really wide topic, and it means lots of different things for lots of different organizations. So really having an understanding of what employee engagement means to you and how this survey aligns to that will ultimately also make sure that your employees have confidence that they are being listened to for those surveys, and that the change in action planning that you're creating because of these surveys is realistic, achievable, and they will actually be heard. So how do you avoid this mistake? Once you have a goal, make sure you include it in your survey communications. Make sure that your employees know how that this survey will benefit that goal. And the other real big factor here is reminding employees that your surveys are 100% anonymous, and that they are really safe to express themselves. This will help them feel confident to share that really detailed and honest feedback that you know will create change for them. So it's about cultivating a greater culture where employees are really given a voice and feel really heard. And making sure that you're appealing to their interests as well. So as long as they're always respectful, the surveys really should provide them with a safe space to express themselves. Mistake number 3, building surveys based on assumptions. So this one feels a little off when I've just said to you, make sure that you've always got a goal in mind, make sure it's always aligned to employee engagement. But this is less about that overall goal and more making sure that we're avoiding all assumptions. So when we feel ill, we might go to the doctor to have that problem checked out. The doctor's going to ask us a load of questions about our health, about other factors in our life, how much stress we're under, how much alcohol we have, and things like that. Those symptoms are usually the effects of a deeper problem. And that doctor's goal when they're asking us those questions is to determine the root cause of the issue. In a similar way, surveys are there for us to test the organizational health of our employee engagement, such as when a workplace issue such as employee turnover starts to have a negative impact, we want to ask questions to understand the root cause of that. So being able to uncover the real underlying issue, that relies on being able to ask the right questions and being able to administer the right tests. So, for example, they may assume, or we may assume, that their management issues are causing high employee turnover. And as a result, we may only create a survey that assesses employee satisfaction with management. Okay. This approach will result in gaining quite a biased and only a partial picture of why your employees are happy and why they're leaving. What about all of the other areas of employee experience? For example, benefits, compensation, career growth, leadership, work-life balance, and more. It's really thinking about that whole picture and every facet that might affect turnover. So how do we avoid this? One, when using employee surveys to understand a root cause, like high turnover, for example, or absenteeism, make sure that you use a mix of questions that allow you to test that broad area of employee engagement that are related to the issue. So don't make assumptions about the root cause. Make sure you are trying to be a little bit more holistic with it. And then also don't, sorry, I've lost my place there. So how does this work when creating a survey with a clear goal in mind? So this comes back to what I mentioned earlier about making sure that you're exploring your goal, you map out all of those related facets, and you ensure you're taking a really well-rounded approach to that issue. Mistake number 4, not structuring the questions clearly. So now we're moving on to the actual survey creation. Question structure has a huge influence on the success of our analysis and thus our action planning going forwards. It's a really important component of the success of your surveys. and how successful they will be. If we don't spend time thinking about the way our questions are structured, we risk creating confusion with our employees, we risk creating a low buy-in rate and a low response rate, and that will impact our engagement rate with our surveys going forwards as well. For example, one thing that we might want to consider is the tone of our questions. We want to aim to keep them as neutral as possible. For example, how much did you enjoy the training session this week? Or how did you find the training session this week? Another is how thinking about how you might want to your employees to answer the question. Do you want them to answer more in the moment or more reflectively? So how is your day-to-day might capture the emotions they're feeling at that moment. How was your week last week will prompt a more reflective answer. There's no right or wrong for this one. It's just something that you should be aware of and thinking about how that will impact the data you're capturing going forward. So how each question is structured is really crucial to the success of your survey. Not only will the structure influence your results, but it will also influence the response rate. If employees don't understand the question, they just won't answer. It's also really important for your analysis. If your question isn't clear, then it can be difficult for you to draw the correct conclusions from the data. So for example, if you're asking a question that has and, are you analyzing that data based on the first part of the question or the second part of the question? So for example, I feel that my mental health and physical well-being are good this month. Which part of that question are you able to base your action planning on? So being really conscious about asking multiple questions in one. So there's a few different things we can use to avoid this mistake, but the main thing for me is just thinking about language, tone, tense, relevancy, and avoiding using and. So language, for example, is the language you're using clear, simple, and easy to understand by all employees you're sending the survey to? Are you using acronyms that only a certain group might use? Are you using overcomplicated language that everyone might understand a little bit differently? Just really make sure you're going through those questions with a fresh set of eyes before you publish your survey. Tone is another one. I mentioned it earlier, you need to aim to keep most of those questions neutral so that you have a really accurate answer and you're not leading employees towards a certain answer. Tense, again, that was an example in a previous slide. Do you want the question to be answered in the moment or more reflectively? Like I mentioned, there's no right or wrong with this one, but it is good to keep in mind that that will change the way that your data comes out in your analysis. Relevancy as well. You need to make sure that you're using questions that are relevant to everyone to keep your response rate high. If employees see a question that is not relevant to them, they'll often stop answering the rest of the survey and also may make the assumption that there's going to be future surveys with questions that aren't relevant to them. So for this one, make sure either you're broadening the question out so it does apply to everyone, or use different surveys for different groups of employees. So for example, if you have just moved offices, and that office move only affects a certain group of employees and you need to review how that move has gone and how employees are settling in, try and aim to make sure that that survey only goes to those employees. And again, using and, if you ask a question that includes and, you risk having a bit of a two-in-one situation, which may mean that you struggle when it comes to analysis. For example, if you are asking about mental and physical well-being and you have a low response to that question, then you struggle, if you're getting a 3 out of 10 average response, do you know if they're a 3 out of 10 for their mental well-being or their physical well-being? So yes, Corey, to your end, I would suggest splitting those questions out into two. It's going to give you real, more pinpoint accurate data. So you're asking there about if you should be splitting them out. So I would recommend splitting them out, asking one question on physical well-being and one question on mental well-being. That's going to give you not only that really precise data set in your reports, but any extra comments that come in based on those questions, you're going to be able to act on with much more certainty because you know exactly what they're referring to. But I will also take this opportunity to remind you to keep asking questions, folk, in your in the Q&A or in the chat, and I will either pick them up throughout or we'll get to them at the end as well. So just another mistake here is not using the right survey cadence for your organization. So just, we need to keep in mind when we're talking about these mistakes that every organization is really, really different and will benefit from a very different set of advice, but also specifically for this mistake, a different pulse survey schedule. There genuinely is no one size fits all for pulse surveys. So if you are ever talking to an HR colleague that is waxing lyrical about monthly surveys, and you'll start thinking, oh gosh, we only do them quarterly, that's okay. There's probably some reasons for that. And you're very different organizations. And you have to act in the best interest of your employees and not necessarily what everyone is doing around you. So just, how can we make sure that you get it right for your team? If you choose so just to go back to kind of why it's really important for a second, if you choose a cadence that's too frequent, you do risk overwhelming not only the HR team or the engagement team, but you're creating too much work that is difficult to balance and prioritize. And you also just set up your action planning for failure as well. There's too much for you to catch up on, too much for you to plan, and too much for you to work on. A good survey cadence also helps your employees create a habit and a routine with the surveys, which improves buy-in from them. So having a think about how your cadence matches in with your employees' workflows and their own routines will make sure they get into a routine and a habit themselves. So how do we avoid the mistake of overloading the cadence of the surveys, or maybe not doing it enough? When you're thinking about the cadence, there's a few things you can keep in mind. The most important thing to remember is consistency. Consistency will help you and your managers create a habit with your pulse survey routine. I will keep talking about habit with this point because that is essentially what we're trying to build. It also helps improve your survey engagement from your wider team because they begin to see regular changes created as a result of their feedback. So one thing I always really like talking to our customers about is Feedback Friday. Now, Feedback Friday might be a weekly thing. It might be the last Friday of a month. It might be the last Friday of a quarter. But just having that Feedback Friday in your head and having it pinned to the first or the last of whatever period you want to work to, it helps create that little nugget in your employees' brains that pinpoints, oh, it's the last Friday of X. I'm going to be looking out for the survey. Another thing to keep in mind is the themes that you're exploring with your pulse survey. The theme of your questions and any that you want to repeat, will provide a really good guide for how often you should send them. For example, if you're including questions on employees' well-being, you might find that really helpful to ask monthly. If you're asking questions on perhaps going back to the office move, how that office move has gone and how employees are settling into a new office, maybe you just want to repeat that every 6 months because those changes that you're creating might be slower. The feedback that employees have to give may not change as quickly either. Another thing to really think about is your employees' workloads and how that changes throughout the year. Taking that into account when you're planning your schedule means that you'll be able to keep your response rate high and you're not adding any extra tasks to their lists around big deadline days or very busy seasons. Another thing to think about is how quickly you can communicate the results once that survey has closed. We always recommend communicating with employees about your last survey before launching a new one. This shows employees that you're really committed to taking action based on their feedback, or if you can't take action, you're showing them how you're digesting their feedback and you're planning on moving forwards with it. This maintains amazing response rates and it also helps build trust for future surveys. So it is something worth keeping in mind. Weekly pulses, while some organizations absolutely smash it out the park with them, they just may not be realistic for certain teams and sizes of organizations. And again, thinking about making those changes based on the survey feedback. Do you need to get changes approved by senior management? And if you do need to make changes, do you need to do policy changes? For example, if you've asked about working from home and then you need to update your policy to give employees better guidance, it's best practice to make sure that at the very least, when you're communicating those changes back, you have an idea of specific changes and timelines before you launch that next survey. Another thing to consider is annual leave. Seems very simple. It's very obvious. sorry, it seems very obvious, but not many folk consider it, is just thinking about kind of summer holidays or winter holidays. If you have a large proportion of your team that are on annual leave, they're not going to be able to contribute to that survey. And it's worth taking that into account when creating your survey schedule as well. I know we've just come out of quite a heavy annual leave period, so it is just something worth keeping in mind. Another thing is just how long your survey is. The more questions you include in your survey, the less frequently you should be sending them. This helps balance that time commitment you're asking of your employees and ensures you maintain a really good overall response rate. So for surveys of around 5 questions, we generally recommend a monthly cadence. But again, there's a lot of different factors that will be very unique to your organization. So please just take that and kind of move with that to make sure it best reflects your employees. The other thing just to consider is how often your business reports on other key metrics. So one thing we sometimes suggest, especially for larger organizations, is perhaps aligning your pulse surveys with your organization's KPI reports. And that means they can be included within management reports. That means the changes in action planning can be approved by your management team. And it's a really effective way to communicate the results to colleagues, not only because you know all of those changes are in motion, but it also shows how seriously you're taking the results. Aligning those survey results to your business objectives really shows that they are at the core of the success that you are viewing. Mistake 6. Assuming everyone will hear about your survey. So this is one that we see quite a lot. It can be really easy to create these amazing survey campaigns full of emails. We might have some Teams messages in there. Sometimes people create these beautiful graphics, and then we will get really disappointed when the response rate doesn't necessarily reflect the effort that's been put into promoting it. So one thing we talk about here is considering the different audience groups just to make sure that your survey really does reach everyone. And why is this so important? You will ensure that your response rate is high, but also that it's inclusive of everyone within your organization. We want to make sure that we're including everyone so that the data that you gather and act on reflects everyone's views, making it more likely to create a positive impact. If you're only reaching 70% of your employee or 60%, 70% of your employees, there's 30% of your employees that change that you create, those action plans that you put in place will not reflect. We also want to make sure that we're gathering the views of folks that aren't confident to speak up using other channels. Surveys are there to help you draw out the feedback from those that typically stay quiet. So again, it's thinking about how we can draw that out and make sure we're truly reaching everyone. So one tip, I only have one, but there's a lot of different parts to it, is just making sure you're considering all of your employee groups and segments. And this breaks down into a number of different points. Think about what their day or week looks like. How do they currently feel about working at your organization? What are your key messages that they will engage with? How do we reach that particular group of people? What is the most likely channel they'll use to engage with your survey? And what's in it for them? So going back to that incentive piece that so many of us talked about at the start when we were thinking about why we would answer our own surveys. So what I like to do is having a think about those groups and putting them together into our kind of 2 to 4 main employee groups. Now, this will depend on the size of your business. It will also depend on the type of your employees. If you're working in an organization that's very, very dispersed or has a very large number of deskless employees, you may benefit from having a few more groups. If you are working in a tech business like ours, where everyone is at their computers all day, we may only need 1 or 2. But having a think about all of these different parts of your employee groups will help you map out where you maybe have gaps in your communication strategy, or maybe even where you have gaps in the survey software you're using. So for example, if many of your employees are out and about all day, we have a customer that has a large amount of employees that are out doing kind of driving, delivery on just never at their desks. How do we reach those employees when they never look at a computer? How does our software and how do our communications facilitate that? Because that group of employees are most likely not going to feel as connected as some of the employees that are desk-based. So having a think about those groups, how they feel about our organization, what will really incentivize them to engage with that survey, and how we communicate that to them is really, really important. And we do have a document on that. So if anyone would like me to send that to you, please just get in touch either on LinkedIn or with my email, which is lucy@stribehq.com, and we'll make sure we get that to you so you can have a think about how you map out those employee groups. Particularly important if you are a larger team. So mistake 7, our analysis of our survey results. So many formal kind of survey tools, or even your free ones like Microsoft Forms and Google Forms, do generate reports and charts that give us a view of the results for every survey question. Some survey software does a really nice job as well of kind of doing demographic reporting. But the glaring error, and the one that the software can't do for us, is how we interpret those results. So when interpreting those results, we can fall victim to confirmation bias. For example, if executives think about or hold one opinion, for example, poor management is the cause of high employee turnover, kind of coming back to our example from earlier in the session, we may only pay attention to the information that's kind of confirming those beliefs, and then downplaying some of the other information within the reports that really kind of threatens what we believe. So it's really important that we aim as far as possible to avoid this. And I feel like I'm preaching to the converted a little bit here, but I always think it's good to have these reminders in our days of these so that we can become more aware of them. So, you know, like I've said, confirmation bias is really can cause us to downplay some data. That then means that we misidentify or underestimate certain issues within our organization. And really, all about avoiding confirmation bias is all about making sure that we can really accurately identify and address those problems. So one thing that it really, really helps and is important that we avoid it is increasing that employee engagement. Employees participate in surveys with the expectation that their feedback is going to be taken seriously, it's going to be listened to, and it's going to be acted upon. If confirmation bias leads us to conduct kind of skewed analysis, that can dismiss certain concerns that employees have given to us, and it can result in eroded trust and engagement amongst employees in the future because they just don't feel heard. It also makes our action planning less effective if we are kind of leaning into that confirmation bias. To create those effective action plans, we really need to have a very clear and accurate understanding of the data. And the confirmation bias leads us to kind of misguided action plans that address perceived issues rather than actual ones. So we need to make sure that we're avoiding it so that our resources, of which I know a lot of us don't have very many, are directed towards the most critical and important areas of improvement. So how do we avoid this mistake? We need to approach gathering employee feedback with a completely open mind. And that does go back to mistake 2 and 3, where we have that goal and we also ensure that we're mapping out all of the facets that would contribute towards that goal. So we're trying to be as objective as possible with that. And one thing that you can use to support you with that is if you do have previous survey data, take a little look at it where it's in areas that you think you need to be tackling, where you may have some bias. So for example, you can look at comments from employees or maybe certain scores and try and understand if there's anything coming out of those that are unexpected or different, and if there's a trend in those, because that might actually help you kind of open the mind up, approach it as an employee within your organization, and kind of remove some of the bias that we all have inside of us. It's not, none of us are immune to that. And then the other thing is just to approach those survey results objectively, even if you see unsettling data. It's just really important that we're keeping in mind that everyone is human. It's okay to have emotions when we see certain bits of data. These employees are our babies, this survey is our baby, and we want to make sure that we do it justice. So mistake 8. This one kind of comes up quite often, and it's thinking about how we become too focused on external benchmarks. Now, external benchmarks are a really talked about subject in surveys. Many senior leaders, management, HR folk want to see how their employee engagement stacks up against other companies. So we can understand kind of, are we scoring high or are we scoring low? And sometimes when we learn about where our survey results sit in comparison to other companies in our industries, for example, we can find it reassuring, like that we're scoring kind of the same as them or a little bit above. But actually, does that mean that we are perhaps getting comfortable with those scores and we're not striving to become maybe one of the few companies that achieve excellent results and we continue pushing beyond that average? Using external benchmarks isn't always important because there's so many factors that contribute to an organization's score. Your industry, your employee size, your culture, the context you're currently operating in. You might have internal changes going on that other organizations don't, your specific demographics and your budgets. All of this is constantly moving, and it's constantly moving in every other industry as well, and every organization within your industry. So it can be really difficult to create a very accurate comparison. External benchmarks can also lead to unrealistic expectations, and they can also hide your strengths and your challenges. You may score average against a benchmark you're using, but does that mean you should take your foot off the gas and not explore or act on feedback that contributes to a score in that particular area? Just because your score isn't flagging as low externally, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is rosy at home internally. So it's just something to keep in mind, that context that we're all operating in is constantly moving and changing. It also might mask, to look at it in the other perspective, any positives you're working on. If you have that external benchmark and you're scoring average, that might be an incredible score for you that you've worked really, really hard for, but that benchmark isn't necessarily reflecting that. So how do we avoid that mistake? I would always recommend creating an internal benchmark as well that really is created with your uniqueness in mind. You can still use that external benchmark, but creating one that is tailored to you and really kind of is conscious of all of the changing circumstances within your own organization means that you'll be able to measure progress. You can highlight your own highs and lows, and it will flag issues and successes much more accurately. You can also use these benchmarks on a regular basis as well. So we recommend including a couple of those benchmark questions during every survey, just to make sure that you can update, review, and progress. Your bonus mistake, mistake 9, all talk and no action. So launching and closing a survey is just the start. The final step in any survey plan is to make sure that you get the most out of your surveys every time, is to communicate the results and any actions that come from them. If you aren't sure that you have the resource to communicate and act after the survey closes, then just reconsider whether that pulse survey occurrence is right for you. It's okay to kind of push things back. Just make sure you're communicating with your staff. Why? Because just to go back to our previous point, we want to create a habit. We want to make sure that there is that regular cadence there. Sometimes it's not possible, but we just have to be upfront, communicate the why, and everyone will understand. So one of the things I like to make sure is that we're talking about what should be included after your pulse survey and in your communication. So it's one thing to communicate to your employees after a survey has closed, but we want to make sure those communications are effective as well. So some of the points you should be including after each survey are thanking employees for participating, making sure you share the response rate and the results, include insights but keep them broad. So things like sharing how particular demographics or teams have answered, keep those out of those general survey communications, but make sure that you're communicating those to specific managers as after this general communications to make sure they have all of the insights they need to support their own teams. You also could share next steps. This doesn't always need to be action. I've talked a lot about action planning, but just having an idea of how you're going to use those survey results and the timelines for those is more than enough. And always make sure you ask employees to share their own ideas and feedback from these results. So it's one thing to ask them for their feedback on certain questions, but once they have an idea of where you might be going with that feedback, what those insights look like from those questions, they will probably have other ideas and other feedback that will really help you shape future surveys, your action planning, and what those next steps look like. So it's always really key to make sure you're continuously asking for feedback and, you know, amplifying that employee voice cycle. One thing I will also say is make sure you share all of the results too, not just the positive ones. Employees always really appreciate transparency. And it can be very tempting for us just to share the positive ones, but all results, please. And how to avoid this mistake. So make sure your survey plan includes your post-survey comms. Always assign an owner and make sure you're adding a deadline to that as well, just so you can hold your whole team accountable. Make it really visible too, if you can. And make a template for your post-survey communications. There's nothing wrong with having a template. I like to use a table that has all of those points I just outlined, and I write a couple of sentences and then craft my post-survey communications from there. That just makes sure that you're hitting all of the points you know will ensure survey buy-in in the future. So just to summarize what we've talked about, we want to make sure that we're building kind of surveys, and we want to avoid, we want to make sure we're building surveys that our employees love taking part in, that they're really engaged with, and they have a lot of buy-in. So we want to avoid these mistakes because we don't want our employees to kind of rush these surveys. We don't want to receive inaccurate data, and we don't want to impact those response rates over time. So, we want to make sure that at all times we have clear goals for our surveys, that those goals are tied to employee engagement objectives that we have. We don't want to build our surveys based on assumptions. We want to make sure we're structuring those surveys questions very clearly, and we're checking that we're using the right survey cadence when we're launching our surveys. We also want to make sure we're considering how we analyze those survey results, removing any unconscious bias, and we're not getting too focused on external benchmarks too, just to make sure we're celebrating those wins and really highlighting any areas for improvement. And finally, our bonus point, we always want to make sure that we're creating action from the analysis that we're doing, and we're communicating that action too. So any questions? I see we have one from Joe, but please make sure you're popping any final questions into the Q&A box. I've also got one from Michelle here too, or the webinar chat. So Joe, we do an annual staff survey and tend to ask the same questions every year to compare year on year. Do you think this is best practice, or do employees get bored of answering the same questions? So the first thing I would say for this, Joe, is that it does depend on how many questions you are asking. And the second one would be how many of those are getting repeated. I would suggest that it's always useful to ask some questions repeated, because that gives you that engagement over time and that score over time. So going back to my point about building that almost internal benchmark, you want to have a look at the areas of employee engagement that matters most to you and your employees. And those areas are also ones that we should be able to affect and change. So if you are in a public sector organization, whilst it's really, really helpful to have half an eye on how employees are feeling around pay and rewards, we all know that that is a very difficult thing for us to affect in based on employee feedback. So having a think about the facets of employee engagement that are important for your employees and that you can manage yourselves, and then have a think about maybe the 5-ish questions, I say, that you would repeat kind of annually, and that will give you your internal benchmark. Anything more than that, it just depends on what's really important for your organization. So if you do have areas that are really key for you to understand, perhaps your organization is really, really focused on learning and development, it's always also good to include questions on that too. But There will be things every year that change for your employees. We know financial well-being is a hugely important topic for us all to be monitoring at the moment. So I would suggest that year on year, if you are doing that annual staff survey, you are putting questions in that reflect those changes for employees' needs and well-being too. I will also say that it's really useful to add some smaller surveys outside the annual survey. So if you aren't doing that, adding those kind of interim surveys in, perhaps pulse surveys, will help you understand how you build those questions into your annual survey, because you'll start to see trends in areas of employee engagement that are useful to explore in more depth in your annual survey. I hope that helps. But if you have any questions on my answer, feel free to keep asking. Michelle, what are your thoughts on Gallup 12? So Gallup 12 for us is a useful starting point, but again, I will come back to my answer that every organization is operating in its own context and its own environment. And you, thanks for joining, Joe, and you know your employees best. So having a think about really what matters most to them and trusting your instinct when you're building those surveys will make sure that you are creating surveys that are really going to affect change and make your employees feel listened to, and make sure that your employees know that you're working on things that really matter to them. So Gallup 12 is a really useful framework, but I often think that you can take it one step further by asking more specific questions, and only you will know what those are. But I'm also more than happy, Michelle, to have a call at any point if you reach out to me, and we can have a chat through about any kind of topics that you think are really important for your employees, and map something out from there. Corey, how many questions would you suggest is the sweet spot? Very interesting question. It just depends on how often you want to ask surveys. So it comes back to that kind of how much time are we taking from our employees for this survey. So I would say if you're going to be asking a monthly survey, I would say 5 to 10 questions is more than enough. Some organizations like to go down to 3. But I would say in terms of actual response rates and drop-offs, we tend to see the drop-off occur after about 30% of the questions have been answered in a survey. And a lot of this relates back to that communication piece as well. So if you are just asking a monthly pulse survey that has 3 to 5 questions, make sure you're communicating the expectations to employees about how long that will take, that they can set aside time in their day to do it, or that they have a specific place to answer the survey if they are perhaps employees that work out of depots and things like that. For longer annual surveys, again, just making sure that you're communicating that. It's not necessarily that there is a right or wrong answer to how many questions that you include in your survey. It's just about making sure that the communication is there and that you're supporting your employees by giving them the time and space to answer those questions effectively. I hope that helps. Does anyone have any final questions? I will just do my finishing off piece, but if you do have any final questions, please do pop them in the box. I'm still really happy to keep answering them. But in the meantime, I will just say thank you so much for joining us. This was such a fun session, and it was really lovely to have some amazing engagement from you all. After this, again, I would just like to remind you that we would love to hear your favorite insights from the talk. Feel free to tag me and tag Stribe. We absolutely love hearing about what you've learned from these talks. We will be sharing the recording of the talk afterwards as well. So feel free to share with colleagues that you think will be finding this useful too. We're always happy to share the love. If you need anything else from me or the team, or have a quick question or need some advice on pulse surveys, please do feel free to get in touch with. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, just search for Lucy Harvey. Or you can reach out to the team at Stribe as well using hello@stribehq.com. I don't think we've seen any other questions, so I will say my goodbyes. Thank you so much again for attending. It was such an amazing session with some really amazing questions, and I really look forward to seeing you all on the next one.